Racism has been a persistent problem throughout history, affecting people of different races and ethnicities in various ways. In this video, I'll be focusing on the experience of Africans and how racism has impacted our lives. To understand the history of racism for Africans, we need to go back to several centuries to the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from the 16th to the 19th century, was one of the most significant and brutal manifestations of racism against Africans. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and brought to the Americas as slaves, where they were treated as property and subjected to the brutal conditions. Many died during the journey, which was often called the Middle Passage. During the era of slavery, prominent figures such as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington owned slaves. In the United States, the abolitionist movement began to gain traction in the 19th century, with figures such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet working to end slavery and promote equality for African Americans. The Civil War in the United States, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, was fought in part over the issue of slavery. After the Civil War, during the period of Reconstruction, African Americans gained some political and civil rights. However, this progress was short-lived, as the introduction of Jim Crow laws in the late 19th and early 20th century reinforced racial segregation and discrimination. These laws, which were primarily enacted in the southern United States, limited African Americans' access to education, housing, and employment opportunities. The civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s was a pivotal moment in the fight against racism in the United States. Key figures such as Martin Luther, Rosa Parks, and Malcolm worked to promote civil rights and challenge segregation. The movement led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. In South Africa, policies were put in place in 1948 for racial segregation and white supremacy. Key figures such as Nelson Mandela worked to end and promote reconciliation between different racial groups. Mandela, who was imprisoned for 27 years for his activism, became the first black president of South Africa in 1994, marking a significant movement in the fight against racism in the country. Today, racism against Africans and people of color continue to manifest in various ways. While progress has been made in some areas, such as legal protection against discrimination, there is still much work to be done to address systemic racism and promote equality for all. It is important to remember the history of racism against Africans and the many individuals who have worked to fight against it, as we continue to work towards a more just and equitable society. So what can we do to stop racism? One important step is to educate ourselves and others about the history and impact of racism. This includes understanding the ways that systemic racism operates and how it affects people's lives. We can also challenge racist attitudes and behaviors when we encounter them, whether it is in our personal interactions or in broader societal context. Another key strategy is to support initiatives that promote racial equity and justice. This might include donating to organizations that work to address systemic racism, attending protests and rallies, or advocating for policy changes that promote equity and fairness. Stopping racism requires a collective effort that involves individuals, communities, and institutions. By working together and taking concrete action, we can create a more just and equitable society for all people, regardless of their race and ethnicity. Let's continue the conversation and take action to create a world where everyone can thrive. Stay safe. Bye-bye.